At over 8,891 kilometers, or 5,525 miles long, the Canadian-American border is the longest on Earth between two countries. Given the vastness of this and the incredibly complicated history between the two nations, it's not entirely surprising there are quite a few oddities along this boundary. In this video, we'll take a look at some of these oddities and explain how they got the way they are. Oh, and if you enjoy this kind of geography content, please be sure to subscribe. It's free, and you can always change your mind. So let's start off where it all begins, off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Following along the border, it doesn't take long until we find our first oddity on Campobello Island. With just over 1,000 people, this Canadian island is home to something incredibly unique, a park administered by both nations. The Roosevelt Camp International Park was once home to the summer residence of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, America's longest-serving president. Over their lives, the president and his wife would spend a fair bit of time at the cottage, as it was one of their favorite places to spend the summer, and unfortunately contract polio. In 1952, a man named Armand Hammer, who had the funny nickname of Lenin's chosen capitalist, would acquire the property, and later, after Eleanor passed away, deeded it to both the Canadian and US governments in 1962 to create a park to remember the famous family. The International Park was officially created in 1964 by treaty, and is jointly run by a special international commission with Americans appointed by the US President and Canadians by the Governor and Council. And according to the treaty, both countries are required to provide equal financial support to the park. Yet while this is technically internationally controlled, visitors coming from the United States still have to cross through Canadian customs in order to visit it, meaning you need all the proper identification, everything that comes with that. This, however, is not the only international park along the border, as there are a few others dotted further along, some of which you can visit without needing to bring your passport, but we'll come back to those in just a minute. Just a few hours north of Campobello Island, still along the Maine New Brunswick border, is an interesting case of trying to use the border to circumnavigate some of the laws and customs of the United States. The Poenkuk Valley Golf and Country Club was established in 1929 during the era of Prohibition, where drinking alcohol was banned in America. A few American businessmen, wanting to get their drank on, came up with the brilliant idea of building a golf course with a clubhouse that served booze just over the border inside Canada, with the entrance and parking lot to the course in the United States, so that they could avoid dealing with customs and get a great round of Canadian golf in after getting a little bit tipsy. While Prohibition officially ended in 1933, the golf course continued to be a popular destination for both Canadians and Americans in the region. And since the entrance and exit is in the States, Americans were for a long time allowed to golf on the course in Canada and come back home without ever crossing through border control. Unfortunately, like most parts of the border, as health concerns grew in 2020, things got a bit more complicated here, especially when the Canadian government closed access to the course for Americans for several months, though later allowing them to visit the course under stipulations like they had to check in at an official Canadian border port of entry, while Canadians wanting to drive to the golf course were redirected through a private property in order to avoid entering America. Sadly for the owners of the country club, since the tightening border restrictions, American membership in the country club has seen a notable decline, and it's unclear at this point if it will ever return back to its pre-passport oddity glory days anytime soon. Just a couple hours north of the New Brunswick golf course brings us to the curious case of Poenkuk Canada and Escort Station USA. When the border was established here in 1842 under the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, it didn't take this area into detailed account, and this resulted in the border actually going straight through half a dozen houses between Maine and Quebec, meaning you could have your front yard and your kitchen in Canada, and your bedroom and backyard in the United States. Officially, the American part of this area has 4 residents, though these are mostly residing in the community seasonally. Historically, when the border was more open between the two countries, Escort was a thriving little community, fit with an American gas station, post office, and makeshift general store, which Canadians would often take advantage of for the cheaper products like cigarettes and fuel, and save on international shipping costs at their American mailboxes. Though in recent years, due primarily to tightened border regulations that came into effect after 2001, most of these services have unfortunately shut down, as custom regulations have become more heavily enforced in the area. This little area also features a small international park called the Parc de la Frontière. While it is several times smaller than the other international parks along the border, it's just as special. The park is split right in half by the border and features an international roundabout, some picnic benches, information signs explaining the area's history, and a small wooden bridge that is half in Canada and half in America. From the top of this bridge, you can take in a view of the river and see for yourself the northernmost part of the state of Maine, which is also, consequently, the northernmost part of America east of the Mississippi. This park is unique for being one of the few places where you can basically walk between the two countries without needing to really show your passport. But interestingly, it's not the only one. Further west, the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park is another example of this, although with a bit tighter stipulations. Established in 1932 on the border of Montana and Alberta, this peace park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and was created to encourage peaceful relations between the two nations, and serves as a formal connection between Waterton and Glacier National Parks. Although, technically speaking, the two parks are administered separately by their respective countries. Aside from spectacular scenery, the park also offers one of the few opportunities to legally visit the United States from Canada without needing to bring any passports or visas. Visitors to Waterton may hop on board a small cruise ship that crosses Waterton Lake into Glacier National Park to visit the Goat Haunt Ranger Station in Montana. Visitors are allowed to explore and walk around America at this ranger station for exactly 30 minutes before having to get back on the boat. If they plan to stay longer and go hiking in America, they have to bring their passport and inform American Customs of their intentions ahead of time. And this isn't the only international park where visiting the other side passport-free is allowed and even encouraged. Further west on the Pacific coast is the famous Peace Arch Park. Located between the Canadian province of British Columbia and the state of Washington, this 42-acre park was established in 1939 as a special passport-free area to promote peace between the two countries, and takes its name from the famous Peace Arch that was dedicated in 1921 to commemorate the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. You know, the war where the Canadians and British burned down Washington, D.C. Anyways, the park is technically two separate parks that are run by their respective province/state jurisdictions and receives hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. Interestingly, due to the unique passport-free nature of the park, when the border was completely closed due to health restrictions, the passport-free loophole began to gain widespread attention, and people with family or friends in either country found out they could circumnavigate some of the restrictions by meeting inside the park. While the Canadian side remained technically closed, the Washington side remained open throughout the restrictions, allowing many people to do things like hang out in tents and even get married, which was actually pretty common. Finally, the last but certainly not least international park I want to touch on quickly is located at the geographic center of North America along the Manitoba-North Dakota border. The 3.65 square mile or 9.5 kilometers squared International Peace Garden was established in July of 1932, just a month after Waterton Glacier was officially created. This park has incorporated the border right into its design and features over 150,000 flowers, a game war museum, auditorium, and even some pieces of the World Trade Center. Visitors wishing to enter the park have to pay a small entrance fee in either currency, but once inside the park can freely walk between Canada and the United States to enjoy all the international park has to offer. But be aware, although you can enter the park without crossing through the other country's customs, you have to cross through your own on the way back, so bring all your needed identification in order to avoid any hassles. Oh, and you might have noticed that there's an airport that looks like it goes right into Canada beside this park, and interestingly, it was designed just to do that. It's one of a few that cross between the two countries to this day. In total, there are 6 operational airports with runways that go across the international boundary. These airports were built specifically prior to the United States entry into World War II as a way to legally transfer American-built aircraft to Canada under the Lend-Lease Act. In order to maintain neutrality, US pilots were forbidden to deliver combat aircraft to the Allies. As a workaround, the aircraft were flown to the Canadian border, landed, and then towed over the border by tractors to be crewed by Allied forces. This isn't the only part of the border that splits infrastructure or buildings right in half. Between Quebec and Vermont lies the town of Stansted, Quebec. Here, the border crosses through several buildings and, most notably, a library and opera house that split right down the middle by the border. The library's book collection and opera stage are located in Quebec, but the main entrance and most of the opera seats are located in Vermont. Because of this, the building is sometimes jokingly referred to as the only library in America with no books, or the only opera house in America with no stage. Since there is no entrance to the building from Canada, all visitors coming from Canada must use the US entrance to enter the building. But fortunately, people coming from Canada are permitted to enter without needing to report to customs by using a prescribed route, provided they return back to Canada immediately upon leaving the building using the same route. And this isn't the only place that's shared by both Canada and the United States. Further west, the border lines up perfectly down the middle of the road, meaning one side of the street is in Canada and the other side in the United States. This aptly named Canusa Avenue is a pretty weird place, and unfortunately for the Americans living here, their side of the street doesn't have a sidewalk, and the border actually creates a fair bit of hassle for those hoping to visit their neighbors just across the street, as they have to check into customs just to go have dinner with their neighbors. And speaking of shared roads, another oddity not far from here is a spot where a fully American road goes right into Canada from Vermont for about 200 meters before going back into the United States. Both countries seem to just generally ignore the oddity, with America continuing to take care of its portion of the road inside Canada. This region also features something that is relatively rare along the border. Pieces of America cut off from the rest of the country country by water and Canada. These are known as penny exclaves, meaning pieces of America that can only be reached by bridge or ferry, and in many cases the only practical way to access them is through Canada. Province Island is just one example of this, as the Quebec Island holds a tiny piece of Vermont at the southern tip of it. Obviously, the largest and most populated of these penny exclaves is the American state of Alaska, as the Canadian province of British Columbia cuts it off from the rest of the lower 48 United States. Interestingly, this penny exclave almost brought the British and Americans to conflict, as US President James K. Polk ran a campaign on annexing all of British Columbia/Oregon country back in the day. America wanted all of this region, while the British wanted the border to fall along the Columbia River. Eventually, the two would agree on a middle ground decision, which would continue to follow the 49th parallel to the sea. As southern Vancouver Island held an important fort and commercial center, they didn't want to divide the island in half, and the parties agreed that the border should go south around the island and follow the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. While this averted a possible major conflict, it created a notable penny exclave of Point Roberts on the Tsawwassen Peninsula, which was overlooked when the treaty was agreed upon. Once the British Foreign Office discovered the area, they requested that Point Roberts be left to Britain because of the inconvenience it would create for everybody, and they were going to offer some equivalent compensation by altering the boundary at another point on the mainland. But the border never ended up changing. And to be fair, this oddity has created a fair bit of inconvenience for the Americans living there, as there's no high school in the point, so kids must take a bus across the border 4 times each day to go to school. And this isn't the only large penny exclave that was created by accident. There's also the northwest angle, located beside the Canadian provinces of Manitoba and Ontario. Here the border juts up in a straight line above the 49th parallel before dipping back down, cutting off about 123 square miles or 318 kilometers squared of Minnesota from the rest of the United States. Currently home to about 120 people, this oddity was created after the British and Americans signed the 1783 Treaty of Paris that stated that the boundary between the US and the British possessions would run through the Lake of the Woods to the northwestern point thereof, and then west to the Mississippi. The problem with this is that nobody knew that the Mississippi ended below the Lake of the Woods, or where the northwestern point of the lake was. But this didn't really become a major issue until 1818, when the two countries agreed to a border along the 49th parallel to the Rockies, which was notably below the northwestern point of the lake, resulting in it cutting this piece of America off from the rest of the country. Over time, there has been some moves to try and have this territory join Canada. Following changes to fishing regulations in 1997, some residents raised the issue of joining Canada, and US Representative for the area, Colin Peterson, actually proposed legislation to allow the vote on seceding from the United States and joining Canada. This proposal, though, particularly angered leaders of the Red Lake Indian Reservation, which holds most of the Angles land, and the legislation never ended up going ahead. And more recently, when the border closed, some residents lost a petition to join Canada, but this didn't get much traction. And speaking of reserves, the last oddity I want to touch on is likely the weirdest one of them all. A little known place called Asquesaznay. Asquesaznay is a Mohawk reservation split not only by the international border, but also by the provinces of Ontario and Quebec and the state of New York. Here the border cuts through dozens of houses and community buildings, but interestingly there's no border checkpoints within the reserve. Home to around 13,000 people, this reservation goes across both sides of the border and also includes dozens of islands on the St. Lawrence River, the largest of which is Cornwall Island. The Mohawk have rejected the idea of having any border restrictions or border processing facilities on their land, and have done large-scale protests and blockades to force both countries to locate their border control facilities off the reserve. But in doing so, they created the only place in Canada that you have to cross through border control in order to visit a piece of your own country. What do you think of these border oddities? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.